Today we're going to talk about the versatility of a table saw and why you may want a table saw to do projects that you didn't know a table saw could do. Hi everybody, I'm Jim Dierdorf and this is Detroit DIY. Let's dig into this. One of the main uses of a table saw is to make rip cuts. A rip cut is just simply cutting a board narrower on its length. So feed it right through, cut it to a new width, and voila. So obviously we can do a rip cut. However, we can also do a cross cut. All table saws have these miter slots. There's two of them on my saw and there's two of them on most every saw that's manufactured. And there's a reason for both of these miter slots. Now we have a miter gauge. Mine has a piece of wood screwed to it. This is the miter gauge that came with my saw. There are aftermarket miter gauges available that are much more accurate, user-friendly, easier to set than what this one is. At any rate, the miter gauge slides into the miter slot. Now at this point in time, we can cross-cut material safely and effectively, feed it through the saw and cut it to the length. Oftentimes I will do this with a wider board. My miter saw will only cut about 6.5 inches, or this board right here. So if I get into wider material, I will do the cross cuts on my table saw because my miter saw just can't make the reach, and it's a whole lot easier than trying to flip the board over and finish the cut. The miter slot is not just for the miter gauge. There's plenty of other uses for these miter slots, and one of them is to check your blade to make sure that it is parallel with the miter slot. You want to do that. On occasion I have a video on table saw tune-ups where I explain this. I show this dial indicator and this tool that I have sitting in the miter slot right now, and we want to check from end to end of our blade to make sure that it is at 0 all the way across, or whatever number you desire to set this on. And it'll slide in the miter slot. It's a little stiff in there, and you can just make sure that your blade is 0 all the way across. If it's not, there's an adjustment. Go to your owner's manual. But this is another very handy use for this miter slot to get your blade accurately set exactly parallel to the miter slot. And you can check your fence with it as well with this miter slot over here. The miter slots can also be used for a multitude of sleds. I have two sleds that I've made, and one of them is a crosscut sled, and it basically takes the place of using the miter gauge by utilizing both slots. And it's, to me, it's a little easier to use, a little more forgiving, and it's easier to hold on to. Let's take a look. So I opted to build one that's a little larger for some work that I've done in the past. But what we do is we put two runners on the bottom, and these two runners fit nicely into these miter slots, and they guide it right through the saw. Now you can buy sleds or you can make your own sleds. And the nice thing about this is I can lay out my 45 cuts. I can lay out cuts on here. As you can see, I've got stuff kind of drawn all over it. I favored it to be larger on this side of the blade than on this side, but most of my cutoff pieces are laying on this side and what I'm keeping on this side. This fence is at exactly 90 degrees from my blade, so that when I do my cross cuts, I get it right on. It makes it nice and easy for line up. This one's getting a little bit tired, maybe time for a new one, but the blade is going to come right next to this line right here, so it's pretty easy to line it up and get accurate cuts every time. I can also get a stop in here if I'm cutting some smaller pieces that I want to cut repetitive sizes. I also have a dovetail clamp sled that I built. It uses these dovetail clamps from Micro Jig, and this sled would be for jointing a board and or cutting a taper on a board. And that makes it very versatile because now you can make tapered table legs, you can make other tapered pieces that you wouldn't otherwise be able to make without using a jig like this. If we wanted to joint the board, we would just put it on here and we would leave it stick past just slightly and then clamp it into place. Then when we pass it through the saw, it is going to cut this edge perfectly straight. We put a little X here, we know that this is our straight edge. We put our fence back on, and then we flip the board over and we run it through against the fence to get the two sides exactly parallel to each other. If we want to cut a taper, we mark out our taper, we figure out exactly how we want it, where we want it to start. We clamp it in here like such, bring this one down, clamp it right here, and then we cut this taper on it when we push it through the saw, and we get a nice taper cut. There's no other way to do this other than with one of these sleds, and it makes your table saw very versatile, and it'll just open up what you can do with your table saw with this little simple sled. The sleds that you can build for your table saw are kind of endless. You can make sleds or jigs for cutting circles. Yes, you can cut a circle on a table saw. You would simply drill a hole in a sled like this, put a pin in it, drill a hole on the bottom side of your workpiece that you want to cut into a circular shape, set it onto the pin with the center of your circle being where the pin is located from the center of your blade or the edge of your blade. And then you would just angle it a little bit, cut it, bring it back, angle it a little bit, cut it, until it's almost a circle just by moving it a little bit at a time and cutting it. Once you finally get it to where it's really close to a circle, you can just set your sled in place and rotate the piece and cut it into that perfect circle. There's so many different sleds that you can use. There's sleds for cutting 45 degrees, all your angles, and just extremely versatile sled that you can put on here and do a lot of things with this table saw. The miter slots can also be used for accessories such as featherboards. Featherboards are really nice to have. Most of them I make myself just out of some leftover stock. Doesn't take super long to make them and they work just fine. The featherboard, especially for beginners, is going to hold your workpiece tight against your fence as you feed it through. Not only will it hold it tight against your fence, but it kind of helps to reduce your chances of kickback because of the way that they're shaped. When the board tries to move backwards, it binds up. It can't move. As you can see, I could probably just about tip the saw over before the featherboard would let that board go. Featherboards are very important for beginners. This will help you get your board through your saw nice and tight against the fence, and it will also help you to alleviate some of the stresses that are created by worries of kickback because of the fact that it's holding it tight to your fence and it locks it into place. The only other thing I want to say is that you always use the featherboard behind the blade. When you're using a tabletop featherboard, it always has to be pushing on the board behind the blade. Never up here at the side of the blade, never at the back. You only use one featherboard, always in front of the blade. The next nice thing about the table saw is we can run Dado Blades. Dado Blades will expand greatly what you can do with a table saw. The Dado set is going to come with two 8-inch blades. They do not need to be 10-inch blades because you're not doing any through cuts with them. Dado blades aren't intended to be doing through cuts. You're going to get a nice set of shims. I have a video on setting these up and using them, so I'm not going to get into great detail in this. If you go to my table saw series, you will find it in there how to use and set up Dado blades. And then you get a series of chippers, and these will set you up for the thickness of the dado that you want to cut out. So the reason you would want to cut a dado in anything, and you can use the dado blades with your miter gauge to do the cross cuts. So if you wanted to cut a dado 3/4 of an inch wide in this board, because you're building a shelving unit, let's say, and you want this board to slide into it, so you would cut a 3/4 inch dado. This board would slide down into this board to lock it in place. You glue it. You could put a couple of small fasteners, and you would have a very secure way of building your shelving system. However, when you are using a dado stack in a table saw, you will have to use a sacrificial fence, and that's what this is. Let's take a little closer look real quick. The sacrificial fence clamps to my existing fence using these clamps right here, and basically it just holds it in place and it saves my fence. And the reason it saves my fence is because in some cases when you're running a dado stack, you are cutting like a lap joint or something like that where you need it right tight against the fence. In fact, I have a relief cut in this one. And anytime you make or use a sacrificial fence, you want to cut this relief in it. And that is so that the dado stack can just set under here ever so slightly and not consistently rub on it. There's a little room for a gap. That helps to keep your blades cooler, and that helps to give you a more accurate cut. So you always want to cut this little relief in here for your dado blades to have a little bit of room. And this is exactly why you don't want it up against your fence, because it'll be scrubbing on it and it'll basically ruin the side of your fence. So thus the sacrificial fence. The last thing in this video that we can do with a table saw is resaw a piece of material. Resawing material in a table saw is not desired, but it can do it. The best way to resaw a piece of material is to use a bandsaw. And what I mean by resawing is we're going to take like a 2-inch or 1.5 inch piece of material and we're going to cut it in half, or we're going to cut it to 1 inch. We're going to remove some of the thickness of this piece of material. Table saws can do it, but like I say, it's not desired. What you would want to do is raise your blade up about halfway and only cut about halfway through this. Your table saw will have a lot easier time doing it. The motor won't be bogging so bad. And then just mark the side that you run against the fence when you're resawing it, so that when you flip it over to cut the other side, so you'd be coming in like this. When you flip it over to cut the other side, you want to keep this same side against the fence again. So you would flip it this way, and then you would finish your cut to take this into 2 pieces, or to remove a 1/2 inch, or whatever you may want to do. So you can do resawing on a table saw. Take your time. Don't force the work piece through, and only try to go half at a time. Alright guys, I may not have covered everything that you can do with the table saw. If you are doing something with your table saw that I did not mention in this video that is safe, please put it down in the comments so that other people can read it. And who knows, maybe if there's a few suggestions there, I will pick it up and do another video on those topics themselves. I am going to put links down in the description for a lot of the stuff that we've seen here today. The gauge for checking the make sure that your blade is parallel to your miter slot, the clamps that we're holding on the sacrificial fence, the dovetail clamps that you saw on the sled. You can also get the dovetail bit. You'll need to use your router to cut them. Pretty easy sled to build, and you can make it any size you want. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider doing so. And remember to always respect the power of your power tools. We'll see you soon.